She had just done the most powerful thing a human body can do. And he walked in, wearing a suit. That was the first sign. Not the coldness in his jaw, not the way his eyes swept the room like he was assessing a boardroom, not a delivery suite. The suit. Pressed. Immaculate. Not a thread out of place, as if he had not come from across the city, as if he had not received the call, climbed into the car, and driven to this room where his wife lay, but had simply materialized here, fully armored, already decided. Jojo didn't know that yet. She still had hope at that point. That was the part that would haunt her. The Wynn Las Vegas medical suite smelled of stargazer lilies and something underneath them, something sharp, antiseptic, metallic, the kind of scent that no amount of luxury could fully mask. The lilies had been misused doing. His assistant had placed them that morning in 4 oversized vases, white petals bleeding into soft cream at the edges, their fragrance thick enough to taste. Monsieur Park did not do hospitals. He did not do mess or blood or anything that forced him to remember he was made of the same ordinary matter as everyone else, so he sent flowers instead, as if petals could cover the truth of what this room had witnessed. Jojo lay against the elevated bed, her deep brown skin still holding the warm flush of battle, 12 hours of it. 12 hours of breathing through pain that rewired something permanent deep inside her chest. Her hair, that thick, breathtaking crown that Misu had once pressed his face into and called the most beautiful thing he had ever touched, was damp at the temples now, coiling soft and tight at the edges the way it always did when she had been through something real. Her eyelashes were wet, not from crying, from sheer bone-deep exhaustion. From the kind of effort that leaves a woman feeling like she has crossed a threshold she cannot uncross. She was magnificent. She just didn't know it yet. In her arms lay their son, small and perfect, wrapped in white, his dark hair thick against his scalp, his tiny mouth parting and closing like he was already learning the language of the world. He had Jojo's full lips. He had Misu's sharp brow. Yes, he was the living, breathing proof that 2 worlds could make something neither world had ever seen before. Jojo looked up when the door opened. She was still trying to smile. She had spent 12 hours thinking about this moment, the moment Misu would walk in, the moment he would see their son, the moment whatever hardness lived behind those dark eyes would finally crack open, and she would glimpse the man she had fallen in love with 3 years ago in a Seoul hotel lobby. The man who had looked at her across a crowded room like she was the only person in it. She'd been holding that image in her chest through every contraction, every wave of pain. It had kept her breathing. She looked up. She smiled. She reached for him. Monsieur Park entered the room the way he entered every room, like he already knew how it would end. He was tall in the doorway, filling the frame in a charcoal suit that sat against his shoulders with surgical precision. His collar was buttoned, his cufflinks were straight. His face, that sharp sculpted face that Las Vegas's most feared crime families had learned to read the way soldiers read weather, was entirely unreadable. He did not move toward the bassinet. He did not look at the child. His dark eyes moved across the room in a slow, deliberate sweep. They landed on her. They traveled down. And then they did something she had never seen them do before. They stopped, not with wonder, not with awe, and with assessment. The silence in the room stretched like a wire, pulled to its absolute limit, and Jojo, brilliant Jojo, who had rebuilt her father's entire financial legacy from encrypted files and ghost accounts, who had walked into rooms full of men twice her age and made every single one of them listen, who had chosen this man when she could have chosen freedom, felt herself shrink beneath that gaze in a way she hadn't since she was 19. Sitting in a boardroom being told her ideas were charming, but perhaps a little above her. Say something, she thought. Look at him. Please, just look at your son. He looked at her stomach instead. The silver lines there, fine, delicate, the kind that bloom across a woman's skin like quiet testament to the life she carried, caught the light of the suite's warm overhead lamps. They were new, still tender, still bright. Misu stared at them the way a man stares at something that is broken in agreement. Your stretch marks make me sick. His voice was low, controlled, each word placed with the precision of a man who understood that quiet cruelty cuts deeper than volume. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He didn't need to. The room was so silent that even the newborn between Jojo's arms seemed to hold his breath. You were the face of this family, Misu continued, still not moving. His eyes still on her midsection, still refusing to meet hers. The standard, the image. A pause, long, deliberate, cold. This, he gestured, not at her, but at all of her, at the bed and the baby and the evidence of everything she had just survived, is not the standard. Jojo didn't move, not because she was weak, because she was calculating. She would understand that later, that the stillness that came over her in that moment wasn't shock. It was a woman who had grown up learning how to read encrypted code, watching an algorithm run in real time, noting every variable, filing every detail, building the architecture of something she didn't have a name for yet. Monsieur reached into his jacket. He set a sealed envelope on the bedside table without touching her, without looking at his son, without a single fracture in his composure. Then he turned, walked to the door, and paused. Not from hesitation, she would understand later, but to make sure she heard every deliberate step. He wanted the sound of his leaving to be the last thing she felt. The door clicked shut. The suite went absolutely still. Jojo sat there, her son warm against her chest, the envelope cold on the table beside her. She did not cry. She breathed once, slow, measured, the breath of a woman who had already begun to think 2 moves ahead. She looked at the sealed envelope. She looked at her son. She looked at the silver lines across her own skin. There's the ones that had just been used as a weapon against her. And she smiled. Not the soft, reaching smile she had offered him when he walked in. Something else, something quieter, something that had no warmth in it at all. "Okay, monsieur," she whispered to the empty room. "Okay." She didn't know yet what was inside that envelope. She didn't know yet what had really happened in that room, what invisible hand had moved the pieces before Michu ever walked through that door. She didn't know yet that the man who had just discarded her had no idea she had been sitting on the most powerful financial weapon in Las Vegas for the last 2 years. She only knew one thing for certain. He had just made the most expensive mistake of his life, and somewhere in the neon heart of Vegas, a clock had started counting down. The envelope contained 3 things: a pre-signed annulment, a non-disclosure agreement with a number at the bottom that was meant to feel like mercy, and a single business card, no name, no title, just a Las Vegas address in clean institutional font that belonged to the category of law firm that existed specifically to make inconvenient people disappear from powerful men's lives without noise, without record, without a trail that anyone with time and ambition could ever follow. Jojo read every word of every page the way her father had taught her to read contracts, not for what they said, but for what they had been designed to make her feel. Overwhelmed, grateful, small, finished. She folded everything back into the envelope with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who had already decided that none of it applied to her. She set it on the bedside table. She looked at her son sleeping against her chest with the absolute trust of someone who had not yet learned the world was capable of this. She pressed her lips to his forehead. She breathed him in. And she began to think. The nurse who entered 20 minutes later was not there to check her vitals. Jojo identified it before the woman had taken 3 steps inside the door, the particular quality of stillness in her hands, the way her eyes mapped the room before settling on her face, the slightly too-practiced neutrality of her expression. She was in scrubs. She had a badge clipped to her lapel. But nurses moved with the specific habitual efficiency of people who had performed the same motions thousands of times. And this woman moved like someone following a mental checklist for the first time. Her gaze landed on the bassinet with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with clinical care. Jojo had grown up in rooms where nothing was what it appeared to be. Her father had been meticulous about that education. The most dangerous person in any space, he used to say, is always the one who looks like they belong there. She pressed the call button. She smiled at the nurse. She kept her voice warm, and her eyes warmer, and her mind completely, surgically cold. Her brother Dre arrived at 3 a.m. He didn't knock. He had a key card she had given him 8 months ago during a conversation in a parking structure she hadn't fully understood at the time. She understood now, watching him move through the suite door with the quiet, deliberate economy of someone who had spent years inside rooms he wasn't supposed to be in, that Dre had already seen this coming. The clothes he carried, the route he had mapped, the decoy vehicle staged 2 floors below. The particular way he looked at her, not with surprise, not with the softness of a brother arriving to comfort, but with the focused operational calm of a man executing a plan he had been refining for months. "We have 4 hours," he said. maybe less. Jojo was already on her feet. She didn't ask how he knew. She asked only one question, because it was the only one that mattered. "Ha, my son." "With us," Dre said. "Every step." They moved through the private service corridor at the back of the suite, a passage that existed for exactly this kind of discretion. Jojo walked with her son pressed against her chest in the carrier Dre had brought, her hand curved around the back of his head, her heartbeat deliberately steady against his sleeping body. The corridor was cool and fluorescent and smelled of cleaning product and steel. And it was the most honest place she had been in years, stripped of lilies, stripped of luxury, stripped of everything decorative. Just a woman and her child and the corridor ahead. Dre told her about the plan as they moved. "They're going to find the car," he said, "and they're going to find 2 bodies." She stopped walking. Not real. His voice was quiet, certain, the voice of a man who had thought about the ethics of this and landed somewhere he could live with. But convincing enough. She looked at her brother in the flat fluorescent light. She thought about the sealed envelope. She thought about the nurse with the still hands. She thought about the way Monsieur had stood at the foot of her bed, not cruel, she was beginning to understand, but absent, as if whatever had once inhabited him had been removed before he ever walked into that room, as if someone had reached into the man she knew and taken something critical out, and sent the remainder in his place. She thought about Chairman Kang. His face at dinner across 4 occasions in 3 years, each one a performance of benign indifference she had read as discomfort, and was only now correctly identifying as strategy. "Do it," she said. The explosion on the I-15 made 3 local news broadcasts before sunrise. A luxury sedan, an unidentified woman, and an infant. A fire investigators would describe as unusually complete, the kind of thoroughness that pointed toward professional involvement, if anyone had been looking. No one was looking. The K syndicate had significant reach inside the departments that would have looked. Jojo watched the coverage from the window of a safe house in Henderson, a modest anonymous property registered to a shell company her father had quietly established 2 decades ago. Her son slept in a second-hand crib. The television was muted. The strip bled its neon amber and gold across the flat desert sky in the far distance, that relentless, gorgeous pulse of a city that had decided long ago to simply override darkness rather than acknowledge it. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. The cold moved through her hand, up her arm, into the center of her chest, and she let it sit there, let it occupy the space where the last of the warmth she'd been carrying had been. She needed the cold. She needed to think in it. Monsieur Park believed she was dead. The K syndicate believed the problem had resolved itself in a way that required no further management, and in that belief, in that clean, confident patriarchal assumption that a woman who had been discarded would simply cease to be relevant. Jojo felt the first real solid thing she had felt since the moment the suite door had clicked shut and left her alone in a room full of flowers that now felt like a funeral arrangement. Control. She turned from the window. She looked at her son's sleeping face, the fullness of her own mouth, the severity of his father's brow, the quiet miracle of what 2 people make when they believe they are building something real. She looked at her own hands, at the silver lines her body had written across itself in the process of bringing him into the world, the marks that had been used against her like evidence of a crime she had committed. She studied them now with something different. Not devastation, not cold fury. Something more considered, more architectural. Her father had taught her that the most sophisticated instruments in the world weren't numbers, they were information. And the most powerful kind of information was the kind that sat completely invisible inside plain sight, embedded in systems that everyone used and no one questioned until the person who understood it decided it was time to activate. She didn't know yet what lived inside her father's vault. She could only feel the edge of it, and that was enough to get her through the night. Her father had never been a dramatic man. He didn't speak in declarations. He didn't compose emotional letters for her to find after his death. He expressed everything he couldn't say aloud in the architecture of systems, in protocols and access layers and encrypted structures, so precisely constructed that they functioned as a kind of language. G1 he had spent her entire childhood teaching her to speak without either of them acknowledging what the lessons were actually for. The vault was not a room. It was a sequence. Jojo found the first layer on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Henderson became her world. It was inside a hardback business law textbook she'd carried across 4 apartments and 2 countries without ever opening, treating it as furniture, as ballast. The second layer was buried in a dormant financial account she'd been instructed never to close. The third was a 12-digit passcode she had memorized at age 9, believing it was a birthday game her father liked to play during long drives. She entered all 3 in the correct sequence. The system opened without drama, a simple interface, clean and unadorned, the digital equivalent of her father's personality. What it revealed rewrote the entire map of her life. Elias. What quiet, precise, unremarkable Elias, who wore the same style of reading glasses for 20 years and made the same coffee every morning, had been the shadow architect of the black box. A proprietary encryption system embedded in the operational backbone of every major casino and financial institution on the Las Vegas Strip. Not just security architecture, the foundational code, the invisible layer beneath every transaction, every payout, and every digital record in a city whose entire economy was built on the careful continuous management of who controlled the numbers. He had built it on contract. The contract transferred ownership upon Elias's death to a holding company established in JoJo's name when she was 23 years old. She had been its legal owner for 6 years. She had simply never known to look. She sat in front of her laptop in the safe house kitchen and did not move for a very long time. Plus, she didn't just have money, she had infrastructure. The kind of leverage that didn't announce itself with bodyguards or penthouses or the particular noise of wealthy men asserting their relevance. She had the invisible kind, the foundational kind, the kind that made everyone who believed they owned Las Vegas actually dependent, without knowing it, on the woman they had tried to erase in a luxury hospital suite 3 weeks ago. She spent the following 3 months doing 4 things with a discipline that left no room for anything that wasn't necessary. She held her son and fed him and memorized the specific weight of him against her chest at different hours of the day. She rebuilt her physical strength with methodical intensity, rising before the desert dawn, moving through routines designed not for aesthetics, but for the particular kind of readiness that lives in muscle memory. She began acquiring K-Syndicate debt instruments through a network of shell entities so intricately layered that even Dre lost the thread 3 levels in. And she built Sloan. Not a disguise. A mask with its own architecture, its own history, its own biography, its own professional reputation seeded across the specific forums and networks where the K-Syndicate sourced its contracted expertise. Sloan had credentials that held under scrutiny because JoJo had constructed them to hold, not with falsified documents, but with real competence she had always possessed and was now deploying under a different name with a different face and a carefully calibrated absence of the warmth that JoJo's face had always carried and that Monsieur had always, in his own cold way, been drawn to. She studied Monsieur at a distance, through data. Through the reports, Dre fed her about the syndicate's internal temperature, about Monsieur's behavioral shifts. He's about the small telling changes in a man who was unraveling in private while maintaining the surface of someone who was completely fine. He had removed every lily from the penthouse, every vase, every arrangement. He had cleared the nursery prepared on the east wing. Not repurposed, cleared. The door locked, the room left empty. She filed both details without feeling them. Or she told herself she did. She looked at herself in the mirror the morning she finalized Sloane's identity, the dark liner. The contacts that cooled the warm brown of her eyes into something flatter, more opaque. Her hair pulled back in a severe architectural style that changed the geometry of her face entirely, that removed the softness from her jaw and replaced it with angles that suggested a woman who had never once reached for something warm to give someone who hadn't earned it. She studied herself for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and accepted the contract that Bayek, Monsieur's head of operations, had sent 40 minutes ago after 3 weeks of vetting Sloan through every channel available to the K-Syndicate's intelligence infrastructure. She was going back in, not as the woman Monsieur had discarded, as the shadow moving through his house, learning his secrets, disassembling his empire piece by piece from a position of proximity he had personally authorized. He had no idea the ghost he couldn't stop thinking about had just walked back through the door he had locked behind her. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a Summerlin high-rise registered under the name of a commercial holding company with no visible connection to anything. Its windows ran floor to ceiling on the north and west walls, offering an unbroken view of the valley. In daylight, a flat expanse of ambition and heat shimmer. At night, it is a spread of light so dense it looked like the city was trying to rival something celestial. Jojo noted the camera placements before she stepped off the elevator. She had counted 6 in the lobby approach, 3 in the elevator corridor, 2 flanking the penthouse entrance. She had already mapped the system's architecture from the access Bayek had forwarded in advance, but there was always a difference between blueprint and presence, between knowing where something was and feeling it, or registering the angle of each lens, calibrating the dead zones, understanding the quality of surveillance in a space that belonged to someone who had been trained from birth to watch and be watched. The penthouse had a specific smell. She had not fully anticipated this. The scotch was there, expensive, peaty, the particular brand he kept on the credenza in every space he occupied, and beneath it, fainter, almost gone. The ghost of something floral that had no business still being there 3 months after he had supposedly removed every lily from the building. She kept her face neutral. She noted the ghost of lilies the way she noted the camera placements. As data. As one more piece of the architecture she was assembling. Beck walked her through the space with the efficient, humorless manner of a man who had developed a profound allergy to small talk. He briefed her on the shadow creditor, at the financial exposure, the concern at board level. He spoke about the shadow creditor the way people spoke about weather, as a force without a face, external and impersonal, a pattern of disruption that had no identifiable source. Jojo listened and asked exactly the questions Sloane would ask. She heard Misu before she saw him. He was in the study, door half open, his voice low and quick. The particular cadence of a man issuing instructions with the authority of someone who has never once in his life had to raise his volume to be obeyed. She had heard that voice in the dark for 3 years. She had heard it in the week since the hospital room in the particular way that a voice you have known in intimacy lodges itself somewhere below conscious thought. She had spent 90 days building immunity. She discovered in the 3 seconds between hearing him and seeing him that 90 days had not been enough. He stepped into the corridor and saw her. The sweep happened the way it always happened, that dark assessing pass that cataloged and filed and assigned value in a single pass. She watched the sweep reach her face and pause, and she felt with clinical interest the thing that moved through his expression before he locked it down. Recognition. Not conscious, not named. Something older than thought, the body knowing what the mind hadn't caught up to yet. And then it was gone. He closed his face the way a door closes on a room someone has decided to stop entering. "Sloane," he said. "Mr. Park," she replied. He gestured her into the study. She sat across from him at a table that could have seated 12, and the distance between them felt both enormous and insufficient. Yet, and she kept her eyes on his face with the cool attentiveness of someone listening to a briefing, and not the exhausting, consuming attentiveness of someone simultaneously reconstructing the precise sequence of events that had led from that hospital room to this one. He spoke about the shadow creditor, about the exposure, about the need for discretion. He was, she had to acknowledge in the part of her mind, she kept completely separate from everything else. Extraordinarily good at this. Shot at presenting crisis with the composure of someone who had never been touched by anything. She had once believed that composure was strength. "I'll need unrestricted access," she said. "Every account, every entity, every contract filed in the last 3 years." The pause that followed was the kind that preceded a decision. She watched him make it, watched the calculation move behind his eyes, the risk assessment, the weight of necessity against the weight of exposure. "You'll have it," he said. She gathered her materials and stood to leave. She had reached the door, her hand not yet on the frame, 3 steps from being fully out of the room when he spoke again, and the quality of his voice had shifted in a way that landed on her skin before it reached her ears. "Has anyone ever told you," he said, "that you feel familiar?" The room was very still. Jojo turned slowly. She looked at him across the full length of the study. He's across the expensive quiet and the ghost of lilies and 300 days of everything she was carrying, and she tilted her head exactly the amount that Sloane would tilt it. Curious, slightly amused, professionally unbothered. "I get that a lot," she said. She left. She did not allow herself to feel anything until the elevator doors had closed completely. And then she pressed her back against the mirrored wall and exhaled one long, controlled breath and watched her own reflection until the thing that had moved through her chest had been identified, categorized, and filed somewhere it couldn't interfere with the work. The most dangerous variable in her plan was not the K syndicate, not Chairman Kang, not the layers of financial complexity she would need to dismantle. It was herself. What he did next, she would not see coming. And it would complicate everything. The access he had granted her was extraordinary and, from a security standpoint, catastrophic. She spent the first 3 days mapping the syndicate's digital infrastructure with meticulous, unhurried competence that made Bayek visibly recalibrate his assessment of the hire. She found 17 security vulnerabilities in the first 72 hours. She patched 11. She left 6 open in places she would need later, flagging them in her reports as low priority and burying them under enough technical language that Bayek's team would not look twice. On the 4th day, she saw the tattoo up close. She was reviewing camera placement schematics in the east corridor when Monsieur came up behind her to look at the same screen. He stood close in the way that tall men sometimes stand when examining something, not invasively, not with intent, but with the unconscious assumption of space that belonged to people who had never had to negotiate their right to occupy it. She could feel the warmth from his jacket sleeve against the air near her shoulder. She could hear the specific, barely audible cadence of his breathing. She kept her eyes on the screen and felt the tattoo on his neck enter her peripheral vision with the impact of something she had been bracing for without knowing it. She had seen it before. 3 years ago, in the specific intimacy of their bedroom, she had traced it with her fingertip on a night when he was rare and unguarded and something approaching open, and asked him what it meant. He had said family crest. He had said it the way he said many things that were technically proximate to the truth, close enough to satisfy a question without actually answering it. She saw it now the way you see something you have always known was wrong once you finally have the correct reference point. The pattern was not decorative. The lines had a precision that was functional, not aesthetic, an encoded structure that, if you had grown up inside the language of cartographic architecture the way Jojo had, was unmistakably a diagram, a map, embedded inside ink on the neck of the most powerful man in Las Vegas, hidden in plain sight on the body of a man who went everywhere and was photographed constantly and whose neck had been examined by the syndicate's own security apparatus without anyone identifying what they were actually looking at. Her father would have appreciated that. That night she stayed in the study until the building was quiet and began cross-referencing the tattoo's encoded coordinates against every property record and satellite map she could access through her father's system. The first 2 coordinates pointed to known Kang family holdings. The third mapped to nothing in any public record she could find. A location in the Spring Mountains at an elevation that suggested a structure built into the terrain rather than on top of it. She pulled 3 separate satellite databases. The structure appeared on all 3, date-stamped across a range of years, indicating it had been built quietly and maintained consistently for over 2 decades. The footprint was modest above ground, but the shadow geometry in the highest resolution image suggested significant depth below the surface, the kind of depth that meant storage, serious, deliberate, permanent storage. She sat back in the leather chair and looked at the ceiling and felt the shape of the story she was inside shift again, the way a room shifts when a wall you assumed was solid turns out to be a door. She began pulling the thread, carefully. Through access channels she had been quietly constructing since her first day in the building, through the black box's underlying architecture, through her father's infrastructure, which moved beneath the syndicate's own systems the way a river moves beneath the ground. She followed the thread in pieces small enough to be invisible individually, assembling them with the patient architecture of someone who had been taught that the truth was always inside the anomaly. A payment, 31 years old, in an amount significant enough to capitalize a mid-sized enterprise, made from a holding company that no longer existed to a contractor whose records had been expunged from 3 separate regulatory databases. A name that appeared in the oldest foundational documents of the K Syndicate, not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as a co-founder. Equal status, equal contribution, equal stake in everything the organization had become. The name was Han Soo-yeon. She appeared in 2 photographs Jojo found in a corrupted archive file that her father's system was able to reconstruct. In the first, she was standing beside a younger chairman Kang at what appeared to be a business opening, both of them sharp and formal. But there was something in their positioning, in the specific geometry of how they stood relative to each other, that spoke of a particular equality. In the second photograph, she was alone, looking directly at the camera, and Jojo felt the image land somewhere behind her sternum with a weight she hadn't been prepared for. Because Han Suyan had Misu's eyes, exactly. The same precise dark assessing quality, the same angular brow, the same mouth held in a line that communicated not coldness, but control. The expression of someone who had learned at some point that mattered, that showing too much was dangerous. The official record said cancer. Rapid onset, devastating progression, on death within 8 months of diagnosis. Medical documentation thorough enough to close every question. But the payment made to a contractor whose records had been erased. The vault in the mountains built the same year Suyan died, secured with encryption that suggested someone had been deliberately preserving something they needed to keep, but could not afford to let anyone find. Jojo sat in the still expensive quiet of Misu's study and let the implication complete itself. Chairman Kang had not just built his empire, he had taken it. From the woman who co-founded it with him, from the woman who had trusted him with equal stake in everything she had helped create. And the evidence of what he had done was hidden in the one place no one would look, on his son's body. She thought about Misu, not the man in the charcoal suit at the foot of her hospital bed, but the man she had glimpsed in 3 or 4 unguarded moments across 3 years. The man who kept every room slightly too cold and had once, half asleep, told her the real reason was that warmth reminded him of a person he couldn't remember clearly anymore. The man who visited a grave in a private cemetery on the eastern edge of the city every year on the same date, alone, without security, without explanation. His mother's grave. She'd never asked. She had filed it the way she filed everything she sensed he was not ready to open. Feed with the specific patience of a woman who believed that people revealed themselves in their own time if you gave them enough space and enough silence. He didn't know. That was what the assembled evidence told her, sitting in this room with the ghost of lilies and the weight of everything she had found. Misu Park, the most feared man in Las Vegas, the heir to the K Syndicate, the man who had looked at her in her most vulnerable moment and found her lacking, and did not know that his father had murdered his mother to consolidate the empire he had then raised his son to inherit. He had grown up inside a lie, constructed specifically to prevent him from ever looking for the truth. She closed the files. She gathered her materials. She was not here to pity him. She was not here to soften, but she filed it into the structure she was building because the most dangerous plans were always the ones built on incomplete truth. What she hadn't found was the camera in the northeast corner of the study ceiling, the one not connected to the main security system. The one Misu had installed himself 6 weeks ago, after the first time he had felt the inexplicable pull of recognition standing near the woman called Sloane, and had decided to start paying a different kind of attention. He had been watching her all along, and what he had seen in the last 40 minutes on a screen in his private office 2 floors above the study had made him very, very still. He was waiting for her in the dark, not hiding, not positioned with any tactical intent, simply sitting in the leather chair behind his desk with the overhead lights off and the city spread luminous and indifferent beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, 1 glass of scotch on the table beside him, untouched, but his eyes on the door with the specific quality of attention that belonged to a man who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. Jojo stepped into the study and saw him and stopped. 1 second. That was all she allowed herself. Then Sloane was back in place, and she tilted her head at the precise angle of a professional encountering a minor irregularity. "I wasn't aware we had a late meeting scheduled," she said. "We don't." His voice was level. He hadn't moved. The city light caught the planes of his face and left the rest in shadow, and he looked in that light less like the polished executive he performed in daylight and more like what he actually was, a man built by a world that had never once been gentle with him, sitting inside the specific stillness of someone who has stopped performing and is now simply present. "Sit down, Sloane," she sat, not because he told her to, because Sloane would sit, and because sitting gave her the geometry she needed. He reached into the drawer on his right side and placed a tablet on the desk between them. The screen was lit. On it was a frozen image from a camera feed, the study, the desk, her, 48 hours ago, pulling records through a system that should have been invisible to anyone not running her father's infrastructure. The silence stretched. "That system you accessed," Mishu said. It doesn't exist in any network architecture my team has documented." He picked up the scotch, set it back down without drinking. "Which means whoever built it beneath mine, before mine, with access that was never granted by this organization." Jojo looked at the screen. She kept her face exactly where it needed to be. "I found your vulnerability," she said. "That's what you hired me to do. I hired you to find the shadow creditor." His eyes didn't move from hers. "And what I've been looking at for the last 48 hours tells me that the shadow creditor and the woman sitting across from me have access to an identical system, built by an identical architecture, with a signature I've been trying to trace for 6 months." A pause, deliberate, weighted. "So I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to understand that I have not slept in 2 days, and I am, for the first time in my life, genuinely afraid of the answer." The room was absolutely still. "Who are you?" Jojo held his gaze for a long time. She felt the mask reach the edge of its utility, the way you feel a structure strain under weight it was never designed to carry, the specific moment before something either holds or gives. She reached up. She removed the contacts from her eyes in 2 precise movements and set them on the desk between them. Without them, her eyes were what they had always been, warm, brown, deep, carrying the particular quality of light that Mishu had once told her in the specific honesty of 3 in the morning was the first thing about her that had made him feel something he didn't have a name for. She watched him see her. It moved through him in stages, first the eyes, then the mouth, then the jaw. Then something that traveled from his face down through his entire body and left him completely still in a way that was entirely different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was controlled. This was the stillness of a man whose entire nervous system had just received information it did not know how to process. Jojo. Her name in his mouth after 11 months of silence sounded like a word in a language he had believed was dead. "Hello, Mishu," she said. He stood. The chair pushed back. He moved around the desk and she stood too, not in retreat, but in positioning. And they faced each other across 2 feet of charged, terrible air with the full weight of everything that had happened between them pressing on every surface of the room. "You're alive." His voice had lost every layer of professional control. What was left underneath was raw and unstructured, and nothing like anything she had ever heard from him before. "They told me. The report said..." "I know what the report said." Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed every version of this conversation for 11 months. But rehearsal and presence were never the same thing. And standing in front of him, seeing his face in full unguarded pieces for the first time since before the hospital room, was something she had not been able to fully prepare for. "I wrote the conditions of the report." He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been grieving when it suddenly appears before him. Not with joy, but with the specific complicated devastation of someone who has built a complete internal architecture around a loss and is now being asked to dismantle it. "I thought I killed you," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession, quiet and structurally honest in a way she hadn't expected. Not the words, what came after, the way He stopped. His jaw worked once. "I thought the way I left made you..." It didn't. She let the 2 words sit there without softening them. "But it was supposed to, wasn't it?" He went very still. "Your father," she said. "Tell me about the night before you came to the hospital." Something moved behind his eyes, deep and subterranean, and immediately suppressed. "Dinner," he said slowly, "with my father, at the estate." "And after dinner?" The pause lasted 4 full seconds. "I don't remember after dinner," he said. "I remember waking up. I remember getting dressed. I remember arriving at the Wynn, and I remember..." His voice stopped as if it had hit a wall. "I remember everything after, in detail. But before that, there are 4 hours I can't account for." Jojo opened her bag. She removed a folder, printed records, pharmaceutical analysis, the documented compound profile of a synthetic aggression enhancer that elevated cortisol, suppressed empathy processing, and amplified existing resentments by flooding the prefrontal cortex with a cocktail that produced, in clinical terms, a controlled temporary sociopathy. She placed it on the desk. She watched him pick it up. She watched him read. She watched his hands go completely still somewhere around page 3, and she watched his face do something she had seen it do only a handful of times across 3 years. Open, not perform openness. Actually open, the mask not lowered but dissolved, leaving behind something undefended and terrible and entirely human. He drugged me, Monsieur said. Oh, he engineered the entire scene, Jojo said. The staff in the hospital suite were syndicate placed. The annulment was pre-prepared. Your father needed you to reject your son publicly and on record, so that the heir to the K syndicate would be documented as illegitimate, so that your father could restructure succession on his own terms. Monsieur set the folder down. He turned to the window. He stood with his back to her and looked at the city. The same city that had glowed beyond the Henderson safe house window on the night she had watched the fire and decided to begin, and the set of his shoulders told a story that had nothing to do with power. A long silence passed, long enough that she began to measure it. Then he turned around. His face was not broken. It was not destroyed. It was something more uncomfortable than either, the expression of a man who has been handed information he would have preferred not to have, like information that makes the simpler, harder version of himself suddenly unavailable. You've been inside my network for months, he said, not an accusation, an observation made with the cold precision of a man reassembling his composure piece by piece because it was the only tool he had left. Everything I showed you, every vulnerability I disclosed, you already knew. Yes. And the shadow creditor? Yes. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She watched him cycle through the stages of a man who had spent his entire career being the smartest person in every room he entered, working through what it meant to have been outmaneuvered this completely, this quietly, by someone he had discarded. What are you going to do? He asked. And his voice in that moment had the specific quality she had never heard from him before. Not fear. Something more exposed than fear. The voice of a man asking a question he already knew the answer to but needed to hear spoken aloud. Jojo held his gaze. She thought of the hospital room, the lilies, the envelope, her son's face, the silver lines on her skin that had been weaponized against her by a man whose own father had weaponized him first. She thought about the grave he visited every year, alone. She thought about 4 missing hours and a needle and a father who had built an empire on the erasure of a woman who trusted him. She did not soften, but she was precise, and precision required the full picture. I'm going to do what I came here to do, she said. I'm going to burn your father's kingdom to the ground. She picked up her bag. She moved toward the door. The only question left is whether you're going to help me, or whether you're going to be standing in it when it falls. She left him with the city, and the dark, and the folder, and the 4 missing hours of his life that had just been returned to him like a verdict he hadn't known he was waiting for. What he decided next would change everything. Chairman Kang announced the engagement on a Tuesday. The notice went out through the syndicate's internal channels with the specific imperial brevity of a man who had never once believed he owed anyone an explanation. Monsieur Park would marry the eldest daughter of the Shin family, a rival clan from Seoul whose primary value to Kang was not their loyalty but their bloodline, their public profile, and the particular optics of a marriage that would, in the language of the world the K Syndicate inhabited, officially close the chapter of Monsieur's regrettable previous arrangement. Jojo read the notice in the back of a car moving through the Las Vegas morning and felt nothing that she hadn't already anticipated. She had seen it coming in the data 3 weeks ago in the specific pattern of Kang's asset movements and the uptick in syndicate communications involving the Shin family name. She had been waiting for it. She placed a call. 2 sentences. Then she opened her laptop and began the sequence she'd been building for 6 months, the quiet, systematic acquisition of a specific property in the heart of Las Vegas, registered to a hospitality group that was owned by a holding company that was owned by another entity that resolved, at its foundational level, to the same shell architecture her father had built to keep her inheritance invisible until the moment she chose to make it seen. The Belmont Grand Hotel had hosted the K Syndicate's most significant social events for 11 years. Its ballroom had been the site of every major syndicate celebration, every strategic alliance sealed over champagne, every performance of legitimacy that the organization staged for the world that was supposed to believe it was simply a very successful family business. Jojo completed the acquisition on Thursday morning, 47 hours before the wedding. She did not sleep Thursday night. She sat at the desk in Henderson with her son asleep, and Dre across the hall and the Nevada dark pressed flat against the windows. And she went through every detail of what was about to happen with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between justice and chaos was preparation. She went through it once, then she went through it again, and then she sat for a long time with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes on the middle distance, and she let herself feel, fully and completely, everything she had been filing away for 11 months. The fear, the grief, the specific gutting loneliness of rebuilding yourself from the ground up in a safe house with a newborn against your chest, and the knowledge that the man who was supposed to have been your family had looked at your body and found it insufficient. She let all of it move through her, didn't fight it, didn't compress it, and let it arrive and pass the way her father had taught her to let difficult things arrive and pass, because the point was never to be without feeling. The point was to feel completely, and then act with clarity. By morning she was clear. She wore black to the Belmont Grand. Not the black of mourning, but the black of precision. A dress that fit the architecture of her body with the specific intentionality of a woman who had spent 11 months making peace with every inch of herself, including the silver lines that mapped across her midsection like the record of something survived. Her hair was down, that breathtaking full crown released from Sloane's severe structure for the first time in months, falling around her face and shoulders in the way that Mafia had once pressed his face into and called the most beautiful thing he had ever been near. She arrived 40 minutes into the ceremony. The ballroom was full. For 200 guests representing the combined weight of the K Syndicate and the Shin family, men in precisely cut suits and women in calculated elegance, and the particular ambient tension of a room full of powerful people performing civility for each other. At the front, Mafia stood at the altar beside a woman Jojo had researched thoroughly and bore no personal feeling toward, a woman who was in every visible way exactly what Chairman Kang had selected her to be. Appropriate, compliant, visually satisfying to the specific aesthetic that the syndicate's patriarchal infrastructure demanded. Mafia was not looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance the way a man looks at something when he has made the internal calculation that endurance is the only available option. He was not wearing his father's decision well. Jojo reached the venue's central sound system panel, which she had accessed earlier that morning in her capacity as the building's new owner, and the microphone broadcasting the officiant's words crackled once and went silent. The room shifted. 200 heads turning in the specific alert choreography of powerful people whose environments have just changed without their authorization. Her voice came through the speakers with the clean, level authority of a woman who had practiced this sentence 0 times because she had never needed to. This property has been purchased and is under new management effective this morning. Per the terms of the acquisition, all events not contracted with current ownership are required to vacate the premises. This is not a negotiation. The silence that followed was the most expensive silence Jojo had ever heard. Then she walked through the ballroom doors. She walked down the center of the room, not hurrying, not performing, simply moving with the specific gravity of a woman who owned the floor beneath every person present and knew it. She watched the guests part. She watched Kang's security detail reach for their earpieces. She watched the expression on Chairman Kang's face move through 3 stages in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and then something she had never seen on that particular face before. Fear. Mafia saw her from the altar and went completely still. She didn't look at him, not yet. She looked at Chairman Kang, standing to the left of the altar in a charcoal suit, identical in cut and color to the one his son had worn to the hospital room 11 months ago. She held the old man's gaze across the full length of that ballroom and let him see everything. Not anger, not grief, not the desperation of a woman wronged, just clarity. the specific terrible clarity of someone who has had 11 months to build something the size of his entire empire and is standing in the room where she intends to detonate it. "Hello, Chairman," she said. "We need to talk about your debt." What happened next, nobody in that room would be able to describe accurately afterward, not because it was violent, but because nothing they had been trained to expect, to manage, to control, had prepared them for this. Misyu stepped down from the altar. He walked toward her. Not toward his father, not toward his security. Toward Jojo, across the full length of the ballroom, with every eye in the room tracking him. And he stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her face. Really looked, for the first time in 11 months with nothing mediating the looking, and what moved across his expression was not something that belonged in a room full of enemies. She looked at him. She had planned for every variable. She had not planned for him to be standing here, in front of his father and 200 witnesses, making a choice that could not be taken back. "I made my decision," he said quietly. Max, only she could hear it. He had not broken easily. She needed to understand that. The man standing in front of her had not walked off that altar because she had given him information, and he had processed it like a machine and arrived at the correct output. He had spent 4 days after the penthouse in what she could only describe, from Dre's reports and the data she still had access to, as a controlled demolition of everything he had been taught to believe. And he had sat across from his father twice in those 4 days, and said nothing. And she knew from the way he looked now that both conversations had cost him something he wouldn't recover easily. This was not a man who had been freed. This was a man who had made the most painful choice of his life and was still bleeding from it. That was the version of him she could work with. "Then help me finish it," she said. The syndicate summit was held annually in the private floor of the Bellagio, a tradition that predated Chairman Kang's leadership, but had been shaped so thoroughly by his hand that most of the men who attended could not imagine it belonging to anyone else. It was in every functional sense his room, his table, his audience, assembled once a year to receive his assessment of the organization's position, his direction for the year ahead, his performance of the particular brand of authority that derived its power from everyone present, believing it was immovable. He did not know that Jojo had been in that room 2 days ago. He did not know what she had installed. The summit began at 8. By 8:15, Chairman Kang had moved through the preliminary formalities and was transitioning to the succession announcement, the item that everyone in the room understood was the actual purpose of the evening. The Shin marriage had collapsed publicly and catastrophically 4 days ago. Adran, the reverberations had moved through the syndicate's internal networks with the speed of information people are trying to contain and cannot. Kang needed to reassert control. He needed to name his successor on his own terms before the question became destabilizing. He had chosen a nephew, a compliant man from a branch of the family that had always known which direction to face. He was 3 sentences into the announcement when the room's screen lit up with something else entirely. Audio. Clear, clinical, unambiguous, the sound of a hospital suite, the rhythmic beep of a monitor. And then voices. 2 voices, one of them Misyu's. One of them the kind of silence that Jojo had held for 12 hours of labor and the first hour after, when she had been trying to find the warmth she needed to believe she was still in a world that made sense. Then the words, in Misyu's voice, played to 37 of the most powerful men in the K Syndicate's network. But in the stillness of a room they had believed was entirely controlled, the silence that followed lasted approximately 8 seconds. In a room full of men trained never to show anything, 8 seconds of visible shock was extraordinary. Then, the second screen lit up. Jojo had given the black box override exactly 15 minutes to run before she walked in. In those 15 minutes, the system her father had built, the invisible foundation beneath every casino transaction in Las Vegas, and had executed the specific sequence she had programmed 3 weeks ago. Not destruction. Revelation. Every financial flow the K Syndicate had run through the Strip's infrastructure in the last 10 years, mapped and displayed in real time on the screens of every financial institution that had a vested interest in knowing that they had been systematically used as laundering infrastructure by an organization they believed was a client. The exposure was total. Not violent, not theatrical. Precise. Devastating. The kind of damage that couldn't be undone with security teams or legal pressure or the particular brand of intimidation that the K syndicate had used for 30 years to make inconvenient people become quiet. Jojo walked into the room at 8:22. She was wearing white, not the white of innocence, but the white of arrival, of something beginning rather than ending. Her hair was fully down, that extraordinary crown filling the space around her face and shoulders like its own kind of authority. The silver lines on her skin were visible at the hem of the dress, not by accident, by decision. She had chosen this dress with those lines in mind, because the men in this room needed to see exactly what had been used against her and understand that she had built an empire on it. 37 men turned to look at her. Chairman Kang's face did the thing she'd been waiting 11 months to see. It didn't collapse. It didn't rage. It simply became, for the first time in all the years she had known it, uncertain. The expression of a man realizing that the architecture of his control has been replaced without his knowledge, and he is only now discovering which walls are still standing. "You look surprised," Jojo said. She moved to the head of the table, his position, his chair, his room, and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked directly at him with the complete terrible steadiness of a woman who had finished being afraid. "You shouldn't be. You built an empire on invisible architecture. It turns out I inherited the foundation." She laid the documentation on the table. The pharmaceutical records, the hospital footage, the records from 31 years ago. Han Suyan's name at the top of a founding document that Chairman Kang had spent 3 decades pretending didn't exist. The room was so still she could hear the ventilation. "This organization was co-founded by a woman your current chairman had removed when her contribution became inconvenient," she said, addressing the room rather than the man. "The evidence of what was done to her and to her son is in the vault at the mountain estate. Coordinates embedded in a tattoo that Chairman Kang had placed on his own son's body, presumably because he understood that the most dangerous place to hide something is where the person most likely to find it would never think to look." She let that sit. Let it move through the room. Let 37 men do the mathematics of what it meant to have been loyal to a man who had built his entire kingdom on a murder. Monsieur walked in through the east door. He had not been invited. His invitation had been revoked 4 days ago, the same morning he stepped off that altar. He walked in anyway, alone, no security, no weapon that anyone could see, and he crossed the room and stood beside Jojo with the specific deliberate positioning of a man making a statement he understood was irreversible. Chairman Kang looked at his son across the length of the table. Something passed between them, and the full terrible complexity of a father and son who have been shaped by each other in every conceivable way, and who are standing in the moment where that shaping finally reaches its conclusion. "You would side with her," Kang said, quietly, not a question. "I would side with the truth," Monsieur said, and his voice in that moment carried the specific quality of a man who has been freed from something he didn't know was a cage. "Something you made sure I never had access to." He placed his own documentation on the table. His own records, the pharmaceutical analysis, the 4 missing hours, the evidence of what had been done to him on the night that had cost him everything. He placed it beside Jojo's documents with the precision of a man making a legal argument. Then he looked at his father with the eyes of someone who has arrived at a place they cannot come back from. "It's over," he said. The silence in that room was the loudest thing Jojo had ever heard. Chairman Kang looked at the documentation. He looked at his son. He looked at the woman beside his son, the woman he had dismissed as furniture, as decoration, as an inconvenient variable to be managed and removed. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent his entire life operating from a position of total control, and was only now, in his 70s, back in the room he had built and owned and presided over for 30 years, encountering its absolute end. He sat down, not in defeat, in the specific calculated posture of a man who was already reconfiguring, already looking for the angle, already deciding what came next. Jojo saw it. She had anticipated it. She reached into the folder and placed one final document on the table, the acquisition notice for the K Syndicate's primary financial holding. Purchased 4 days ago through a chain of entities that ultimately resolved to a single owner. Her name. She owned it, not the debt, the entity itself. She had been buying it piece by piece for 11 months, through a method so slow and so precise, and so completely beneath the threshold of any alert that the syndicate's own compliance infrastructure had never flagged it once. "There's nothing left to reconfigure," she said, looking at the chairman. "Every move you make from this point is one I've already accounted for." She straightened. She picked up her folder. "Your lawyers will receive the full transfer documentation by morning." She turned to leave. What happened next, nobody in that room would ever publicly confirm. But the recording JoJo had been running since the moment she walked in captured all of it. 3 months later, the K Syndicate ceased to exist. Not loudly. Not in the way that empires usually ended. In fire and spectacle and the particular public drama of men who cannot accept that their story is over. It ended the way the most significant endings always happened in JoJo's experience. In paperwork. In the clean bureaucratic finality of entities dissolved, accounts closed, structures dismantled, and the specific permanent silence that falls over a thing that has been formally and completely concluded. Chairman Kang faced a private tribunal convened by the surviving members of the syndicate's board, men who had been given a choice between the documentation JoJo had placed on that table and the particular kind of legal exposure that came from continued loyalty to someone whose entire foundation had been built on a crime. They chose, unanimously and efficiently, self-preservation. Kang was removed from every position he held, every account he controlled, every room he had ever owned. She had not wanted him imprisoned. She had wanted something her father would have recognized as more sophisticated. She had wanted him to live in what was left. The mountain estate was searched. The vault was opened by JoJo with Mafia standing beside her in the fluorescent utility light of a basement room that smelled of concrete and sealed air, and the specific quality of time kept deliberately still. What they found inside was extensive, the full record of what had been done to Han Soo-yeon, documented with the obsessive thoroughness of a man who had needed to preserve the evidence of his crime the way some people needed to preserve trophies. Mafia didn't speak for a long time after. He sat on the floor of that basement with the documents in his hands, and JoJo stood 3 feet away and gave him the specific gift of not filling the silence. She understood silence. She had lived inside it for 11 months. She understood that some things required a space large enough to hold them, and that the correct response to a person discovering the foundational lie of their entire life was not comfort, but presence. He looked up at her eventually. His face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not broken, not destroyed, but stripped of every layer of the architecture that 30 years of his father's world had built over whatever had been there originally. What was underneath was younger than anything she had expected, quieter. "I don't know who I am without it," he said. "You're the man who stepped off that altar," she said. "Start from there." He held her gaze. She let him. Not as an offering, not as forgiveness. She had not arrived at forgiveness, and she was honest enough with herself to know that forgiveness was not a switch, but a process, and she was somewhere in the middle of it, and that was enough for now. She extended her hand, not with warmth, with something more durable. The specific handshake of 2 people entering an arrangement built on accountability rather than sentiment. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He reached out and took it. His grip was careful, not weak. Careful. As if he understood that what he was holding was something that could be withdrawn. The terms were clear. She had written them herself. He would spend the following 12 months operating as her organization's head of security, not as a partner, not as an equal, but as someone earning a position he did not yet deserve. He would submit every significant decision to her review. He would have no financial authority over any entity she controlled, and he would have supervised visitation with their son, structured, consistent, non-negotiable in its schedule, beginning immediately. Because whatever had happened between the 2 of them, she had never intended for her son to grow up not knowing his father, only to grow up knowing the right version of him. Mafia accepted every term. She'd prepared counter-arguments, escalating positions, contingency responses for each point of likely resistance. He offered none. He read the document, looked up once, and signed it with the clean final motion of a man who had no leverage left, and had decided somewhere in the space between the summit and this room that he wasn't interested in leverage anymore. She watched him sign and felt something shift inside her, not softening, not capitulation, but the specific internal recalibration of a plan that had achieved its objective and needed to be updated for what came next. She had built the entire last 11 months around an ending. She had not yet built anything around the morning after. 6 months after that, the organization she incorporated under the name the JoJo Group held controlling interest in 4 Las Vegas properties, the Black Box's parent architecture, and a portfolio of debt instruments whose combined value made her one of the most powerful financial presences in Nevada. She had achieved all of it before her son's first birthday. She stood on the balcony of the penthouse she had purchased, not Misu's building, but her own, higher than his, with a view of the entire valley. On the evening of her son's birthday party with him against her hip, and the Nevada sunset spreading itself across the sky in colors that had no right to be that beautiful over a city this complicated. Her son reached for the light with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been told he couldn't have it. She heard footsteps behind her, measured, unhurried, the specific cadence she knew better than she would ever admit to anyone. Misu stopped 5 feet away. But he held the distance with the care of someone who understood that distance was no longer something he was authorized to close without permission. He had learned, across 6 months of earning his way back into rooms she controlled, the specific grammar of a man who had forfeited the right to assume. He looked at his son. Something moved across his face that was entirely unguarded and entirely his, the specific devastation and wonder of a father looking at a child he had almost never known. Then he looked at her. At her face, at the crown of her hair loose in the evening wind, at the silver lines visible at the edge of her sleeve where she had rolled it back, the marks that had once been used as a weapon against her and that she now wore with the specific quiet authority of someone who had decided what they meant. He moved toward her. He stopped at her side. And he lowered himself, not quickly, not performatively, but with the deliberate full-weight motion of a man making a statement. He intended to be permanent, and he pressed his lips to those lines, gently, with a reverence that had nothing theatrical about it, the way a person touches something they have come to understand, too late, but genuinely, was the most extraordinary thing they were ever near. Jojo looked out at the valley. She felt the weight of everything, the 11 months, the safe house, the vault, the summit, the document he had signed, or the 6 months of watching him become someone she had not known he was capable of being. She felt her son's solid, certain weight against her hip. She felt the desert wind. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The K syndicate was gone. Chairman Kang sat in the house he had built on someone else's foundation and occupied a smaller and smaller room inside it every day. Misu Park was 5 feet away and earning every inch. And Jojo, brilliant, patient, precise Jojo, stood on a balcony she owned in a city she now moved through like a current beneath its surface. And she looked at her son looking at the light, and she allowed herself, quietly and without announcement, to begin. Not to forgive. Not yet. But to build. And she had always been extraordinary at building. If you made it to the very end of this story, then you already know this channel is exactly where you belong. If JoJo's journey moved you, shook you, or had you talking to the screen, hit that subscribe button right now because we have more stories exactly like this one ready for you, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs a great story tonight, and drop your city in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And I need to know, did Misu earn his second chance, or did JoJo give him more than he deserved? Let the debate begin. Comment Team JoJo or Team Misu, and let's talk about it. I will see you in part 2. The JoJo Empire is just getting started.